The desert was silent before dawn, that strange, heavy silence that comes before everything explodes. You could taste the dust in the air. The wind was sharp, whispering through the tents, carrying the distant thud of artillery like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. In one corner of a makeshift camp, a young soldier knelt on the cold ground. His helmet rested beside him. His rifle lay within reach, but in his trembling hands, he held something infinitely more powerful, a small black rosary, its beads dulled and worn smooth by time and prayer. He ran his thumb along the crucifix, the way a child might touch the face of a loved one, and whispered into the dimness, "Hail Mary, full of grace." The voice was soft but steady. Around him the camp stirred, soldiers murmuring, boots clattering, metal scraping against metal. The engines of war were waking. Yet in that pocket of stillness, heaven touched earth. That soldier's name was Michael, and the story you are about to hear, his story, is one that has been told in hushed tones among chaplains and comrades alike, carried by veterans who swore they saw something no words could explain. Michael had not always been a praying man. He was the kind of soldier who laughed at faith, the kind who filled his days with noise to silence the questions in his heart. He used to say that God was for the safe and the soft, not for those who'd stared down the barrel of reality. But all that changed on one night, one brutal, blood-red night, when he found himself surrounded, lost, and certain that he would not see another sunrise. It had begun with an ambush. The patrol had gone wrong from the start. Wrong terrain, wrong coordinates, wrong timing. Within minutes, they were caught in a crossfire that cut through the desert like lightning. The sky burned with tracer rounds. The sand exploded in fountains of fire. The air smelled of gunpowder and iron and fear. When the smoke cleared, Michael was alone. He dragged himself behind a broken wall, bleeding, disoriented, his radio destroyed. Around him, the night stretched endless and silent again, except for the faint mechanical hum of the enemy's approach. That's when he felt it, something in his pocket. He reached inside and pulled out the rosary. It wasn't his. It had belonged to his mother. She'd pressed it into his hand the morning he shipped out, whispering, "Mary will walk beside you where I cannot." He had almost laughed, but now, under a sky painted with fire, that rosary was all he had. Michael had never really prayed before. Not sincerely, not from the marrow of his being. But desperation has a way of making a man honest. He held the beads tight, his blood smearing their black surfaces, and he began, hesitantly, brokenly, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Each prayer rose like smoke from the ashes of his fear. At first, his voice trembled. Then it steadied. Then it grew stronger. He prayed the first decade for his mother, the second for his brothers in arms, the third for the souls of those who had fallen, friend and enemy alike. By the fourth, he could barely breathe, but his soul was alight. By the fifth, something changed. He felt it before he saw it, a warmth, gentle but immense, seemed to fill the air around him, not heat from the burning sand, but a light that breathed peace into the heart of terror. The gunfire, the chaos, the fear all seemed to recede, and then, in the glow of that impossible stillness, he saw her, not with his eyes, but with the sight of the soul, the kind of vision that burns deeper than light itself. Mary stood beside him, not as a statue, not as a distant figure from stained glass, but as a mother, radiant, sorrowful, and strong. Her veil flowed like silver wind. Her eyes shone with a love that could unmake despair. She did not speak aloud, yet Michael heard her clearly. "Do not be afraid. My son is with you." He wept, silently, fiercely, freely, the way men do when grace finally breaks through the iron gates of their hearts. When dawn came, his comrades found him alive, somehow untouched by the barrage that had ravaged the entire valley. His uniform was torn, his weapon gone, but his rosary glowed faintly in the early light. From that day forward, Michael was not the same. He still bore the scars of battle, the limp, the tremor in his hands, but he carried something far greater within him, the unshakable conviction that Mary had come for him when he least deserved it. Years later, he would tell his story not as a tale of survival, but as a testimony of mercy. He would hold that same rosary in church pews, in hospital beds, in the hands of dying soldiers who couldn't remember the words to pray. He would whisper to them, "She'll come for you too. Just call her name." That is where this episode begins. A battlefield, a rosary, a miracle hidden beneath the noise of war. Stay with us as we uncover the rest of Michael's story. How Our Lady's presence followed him through recovery, redemption, and an act of faith that changed more lives than he ever knew. This is the story of a man who found peace not in the silence after the gunfire, but in the whisper of a prayer that conquered it. They found him just after dawn. The first streaks of gold were breaking across the desert when a medic stumbled upon a shape half buried in dust and debris, a man clutching something in his hands, motionless. For a moment they thought he was gone, but then faintly came a whisper, "Hail, Mary, full of grace." When they rolled him onto a stretcher, the medic saw the rosary tangled in his fingers, the beads pressed so tightly they'd left small imprints in his skin. He should not have survived. There was no cover, no medical kit, no signal. The report later said the blast radius had been total, 0 chance of survival. And yet, Michael lived. When he awoke in the field hospital days later, the world came back in fragments, the hum of generators, the sterile sting of antiseptic, the murmur of nurses speaking softly. His vision was blurred, his body wrapped in bandages, but the first thing he asked for was not water, it was his rosary. The chaplain assigned to the ward, an older priest named Father Elias, brought it to him the next morning. It was astonishingly intact, save for a single cracked bead. As Father Elias placed it in his palm, Michael felt a surge of something deep and wordless move through him. Gratitude, awe, and a strange, holy fire. "I shouldn't be here," he murmured. "But she came for me." The priest didn't interrupt. He'd heard hundreds of stories from men broken by battle, hallucinations, dreams, near-death visions. But there was something in Michael's eyes that silenced all doubt. They weren't the eyes of a man delusional from pain. They were the eyes of someone who had seen. In the weeks that followed, Michael's recovery defied medical explanation. His lungs, crushed by debris, began to heal. His hearing, damaged by concussion, returned almost completely. Even the doctors used words like unexplainable and inexplicable stability. But for Michael, the true healing was interior. He spent his long hours not in bitterness or anger, but in prayer. Every night, as the camp dimmed and the desert cooled, he would whisper the rosary under his breath. And slowly, one by one, the other soldiers in the ward began to join him. At first, it was curiosity, then it became comfort, and finally, it became habit, almost sacred routine. Men who had never prayed before found themselves mouthing the words of the Hail Mary, stumbling at first, then reciting them with trembling conviction. Father Elias later wrote in his journal, "I've seen morphine calm the body, but only the rosary calms the soul." Word spread through the camp about the soldier who survived against all odds and now prayed for everyone, friend and foe alike. They called him the man with the miracle beads. When Michael was finally cleared to leave, the day of departure felt like a quiet feast. The nurses lined up to say goodbye. Some slipped small folded notes into his hands, names of loved ones, prayer intentions. He promised to pray for them all before he boarded the transport. Father Elias pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Son," he said, "do you know what the first thing Our Lady does when she enters a battlefield?" Michael shook his head. "She looks for the wounded, and she stays with them, always. You are living proof." The journey home was long. He watched the desert fade into clouds, and the clouds give way to the familiar green of his homeland. But he was not returning as the same man who had left. The world called him a hero, medals, interviews, ceremonies. Yet every time someone asked how he survived, his answer was always the same: "I didn't. She saved me. In his heart, he knew that what had happened was not meant for him alone. It was meant to be shared, a light carried into the hearts of those who still wandered in darkness. So he began to tell his story. At first, only to family and close friends, then to small church groups, eventually to entire congregations, soldiers' chapels, and even prisons. Everywhere he went, he brought the same rosary, now worn and faintly cracked, and held it up with reverence. These beads, he would say, are not just prayers. They are chains that bind heaven to earth, and even on the battlefield they never break. But Michael's journey was not yet over, for with grace comes a calling. One evening, while walking near a quiet seaside chapel, he felt the same warmth he had felt in the desert years before, that unmistakable peace that silences all fear. And in that silence, a single thought rose within him, clear and strong: go back. There are still souls to save. It wasn't madness. It wasn't imagination. It was purpose, burning and pure. Within months, Michael joined a Catholic outreach ministry that served veterans suffering from trauma and despair. He traveled across the country, praying with those who could no longer believe in anything. He would hand them small rosaries, each blessed by a priest, and tell them, "I brought this from the battlefield. The same mother who found me there will find you here." Men who hadn't prayed in decades began to weep, hardened. Soldiers broke down and embraced him. Some found confession again after, years away, and wherever he went, stories followed. Conversions, healings, reconciliations. He never took credit. He always said, "It's Mary, it's always her." But behind all that light, one mystery still remained: the cracked bead. No matter how many times it was repaired, it would break again, in the same place. He began to wonder, was it a flaw or a sign? Father Elias, when asked years later, smiled and said, "Maybe that bead carries the mark of the wound that saved you." Sometimes, heaven leaves a scar to remind us of the miracle. It was nearly 10 years after the war when Michael found himself once again standing before a field of crosses, not in the desert, but in a quiet cemetery near his hometown. The grass shimmered under the morning dew, and the wind moved gently through the flags that flanked the rows of graves. He had come not as a soldier now, but as a pilgrim. He walked among the names, brothers in arms who had not come home, whispering a decade of the rosary for each. The beads slid through his fingers with slow reverence, each Hail Mary falling like a tear upon the earth. And then he stopped at one grave, a name he knew too well, Private Daniel Reeves. Daniel had been only 19 when he fell. It was Daniel who had handed Michael his first rosary before deployment, laughing as he said, "You'll need this more than your rifle." Michael knelt and placed the cracked rosary gently on the stone. "You were right, Danny," he whispered. "It never left my hand, and it never failed me." He bowed his head. The silence stretched between heaven and earth, vast and holy. Then from deep within his chest came that same familiar warmth, the one he had felt on the battlefield, and later by the sea. It was as if Our Lady herself stood there beside him once again, unseen but unmistakable, the Queen of Peace walking softly among the graves of her sons. That night, Michael could not sleep. He sat by the window of his small apartment, the moonlight spilling across his desk. Letters from other veterans lay scattered before him, stories of loss, despair, and tiny miracles. Some spoke of newfound faith, others of final moments before death. He read them all, one by one, his fingers tracing each name, each plea. Then, without planning to, he began to write back, not with speeches or theology, but with a soldier's simple faith. "Brother, you are not forgotten. The Blessed Mother walks beside you. When you cannot pray, she prays for you. Hold your rosary even in silence. Grace will find its way." It became his ministry. Every night, letters went out to men and women scattered across the country, spiritual lifelines carried in envelopes. He never sought recognition. His only goal was to help them hold on to hope, one bead at a time. And yet the letters multiplied. So many came back, filled with gratitude and confessions of faith rediscovered. Some included photos of families reunited or medals once buried in drawers now worn again with pride. He saw it then, how the rosary had become a bridge between the battlefield and the heart, between despair and redemption. But there was one letter that stopped him cold. It came from a hospital in another state, from a young soldier named Aaron. The words were shaky, written in pencil. "Sir, I don't know if you remember me. I was in your unit for a short time before the blast. I heard your story later, how you prayed through it. I'm writing now because I don't think I can do this anymore. The nightmares won't stop. The doctors can't help. I'm afraid, and I don't know how to pray." Michael read it over and over. Something deep inside told him he had to go. He packed a small bag, Bible, rosary, a few medals, and boarded a night train. The journey was long, and his body, now aging and weakened, ached with every hour. But his heart burned with purpose. When he arrived, the hospital ward was dimly lit. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the sterile hum of machines. And there, by the window, sat Aaron, pale, trembling, his eyes hollow with sleeplessness. Michael approached quietly. "Son," he said gently, "I came to pray with you." Aaron turned, disbelief flashing across his face. "You came all this way for me?" Michael nodded and reached into his pocket, drew out the old rosary, the same one from the battlefield, its cracked bead faintly glimmering under the fluorescent light. "This has been through fire," he said softly, "and it's still here. So are you." Aaron began to cry, and that night, for the first time in years, the young man prayed, haltingly, painfully, but sincerely. Michael prayed beside him, their voices blending into a single quiet rhythm. Hail Mary, full of grace. Each word seemed to lift a weight, each decade like a breath of freedom. By dawn, Aaron had fallen asleep, peacefully, without tremors. Michael smiled, closing his eyes in silent thanksgiving. "She never fails," he murmured. The next morning, a nurse found Michael still sitting by the bedside, his rosary clasped between his hands. His eyes were closed, his expression serene. He was gone. There was no struggle, no fear. Only peace, the kind that saints are said to wear when heaven opens its gates. Aaron later said that when he awoke, the first light of morning was streaming through the window, and for a moment he thought he saw a woman's silhouette standing near the bed, gentle, radiant, veiled in white. Then she was gone. When the news spread, veterans across the country began to pray the rosary again in Michael's memory. Some said they felt his presence when they prayed. Others claimed small miracles, moments of grace that defied explanation. Father Elias, now retired, presided at Michael's funeral. He held up the worn rosary during the homily and said simply, "This is not a relic of death but of resurrection. A soldier's last rosary has become a nation's prayer." Weeks passed after Michael's funeral, yet his presence lingered like incense after Mass, subtle, fragrant, and holy. In the parish, where he had once sat quietly in the back pew, a small framed photo of him now rested near the statue of Our Lady of Sorrows. Beneath it, the old rosary lay encased in glass. The once cracked bead caught the sunlight every morning, sending a faint glimmer across the altar, as if to say, "I am still here." People began coming from far and wide. Soldiers, widows, mothers, young men battling despair, each one drawn by something they couldn't explain. They knelt before the display and prayed. Some left their own rosaries behind. Others whispered stories of healing, forgiveness, and hope. One woman, a nurse who had once treated Michael at the Veterans Hospital, had told how her chronic anxiety had lifted after asking for his intercession. "It wasn't a miracle of thunder or vision," she said. "It was peace, a deep, quiet peace, the kind you can live in." Another man, a soldier struggling with alcohol addiction, spoke through tears. "I hadn't touched my rosary in 10 years. But that story, his story, it found me. I picked it up again, and something changed. I'm free." It was as though Michael's mission had not ended with his death. It had only just begun. Father Elias, watching all this unfold, felt a stirring in his soul. He had known saints before, the quiet kind, the ones whose holiness was not in sermons or books, but in hidden acts of love. Michael had been one of them. He began organizing a monthly rosary gathering in Michael's honor. At first, it was just a handful of parishioners, but soon word spread beyond the town. Veterans associations, prayer groups, even skeptical journalists began attending. Drawn by curiosity but leaving with tears, each meeting began with the same prayer: for all who carry the wounds of war, visible and invisible, for all who fight battles no one else can see, Mother of Mercy, pray for us. The gatherings grew. Videos of these prayer circles began circulating online. Men in uniform, mothers with candles, teens clutching rosaries under the open sky. No branding, no theatrics, just raw prayer. And through it all, the refrain that had guided Michael's life echoed again and again: when you cannot pray, she prays for you. Months later, the diocese opened an inquiry into the reports of intercession connected to Michael. There was no talk of sainthood. Not yet, but the testimonies poured in like spring rain. One account described a man saved from suicide after a stranger handed him a rosary and said it once belonged to a soldier named Michael. Another told of a family reconciled. After 15 years of silence, even Father Elias admitted that one night during prayer, he had felt what he could only describe as a presence of luminous peace filling the chapel. "I do not seek signs," he said, "but grace has its own language." And tonight, I understood every word. The story soon reached beyond the parish walls. Documentaries, podcasts, and online testimonies began sharing the soldier's rosary story. But those who had truly known Michael always insisted on one thing: don't make him a legend. Remember his prayer, because that was what he would have wanted. Not fame, not praise, but conversion. Souls returning to the mother who had carried him through the valley of death. In one powerful scene that spread online, a Marine stood before a crowd of young recruits, holding up his own battle-worn rosary. "This," he said, "was my weapon before any rifle. A man named Michael taught me that courage doesn't end when the gunfire stops. It begins when you start to pray." The crowd fell silent. For many, it was the first time they saw strength not as defiance, but as surrender to God through the hands of Mary. And in that silence, something holy was born. Father Elias would later say in an interview, "The battlefield didn't take Michael's soul, it forged it." And now, through his story, the Blessed Mother is still recruiting soldiers, not for war, but for peace. Each year on the anniversary of his passing, veterans and families gather at the cemetery. They pray the rosary at dawn, the light of the rising sun glinting off the medals pinned to their coats. As the final "Hail, Holy Queen" fades into the morning air, someone always begins the last words he spoke before dying: "She never fails." And the crowd answers softly, "She never fails." The phrase has become a prayer, a mantra, a quiet anthem echoing through barracks and living rooms, prisons and hospitals. Wherever hearts tremble and faith flickers, that old cracked rosary, the one that passed through fire and fear, now rests in the parish museum of military chaplains. But its replicas have multiplied. Thousands have been made, carried into homes, hospitals, even new war zones. Each one bears a small engraving on the crucifix: "Peace through Mary, the soldier's rosary." The wind swept softly over the field where his story began. A simple patch of earth, wildflowers brushing against worn gravestones. Yet for those who came to pray there, it felt like hallowed ground. The kind of place where heaven bends low to listen. They would kneel, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, the rosary coiled in their hands like a lifeline. Some prayed for sons still deployed. Some prayed for healing. Others simply whispered, "Thank you." The air seemed to carry their prayers upward, not in thunder or triumph, but in the steady rhythm of faith. "Hail Mary, full of grace." And somewhere beyond sight, perhaps the soul of that soldier prayed with them still. Michael's story, after all, wasn't about death. It was about transformation, the mysterious alchemy by which suffering becomes sanctified, fear becomes faith, And a weapon of war becomes a chain of peace. Every bead he once held had been baptized by the tears, the blood, and the courage of a man who learned that true strength begins on one's knees. He had entered battle believing he would fight for freedom. He died discovering that the greatest freedom is not the one men win with arms. It's the one God gives when a heart surrenders through prayer. If the rosary could keep him standing in a storm of bullets, said Father Elias once, imagine what it can do for you in the quiet battles of the soul. Because we all have our battlefields. They may not roar with gunfire, but they echo with fear, despair, loneliness, and guilt. Some wars rage in the mind, between anxiety and peace, others in the heart, between resentment and forgiveness, still others in the soul, between despair and hope. And in each of these battles, heaven still offers the same weapon, the rosary, not to destroy, but to restore, not to conquer, but to heal, not to take life, but to give it. When you take the rosary into your hands, you take hold of something more powerful than steel, something forged in love, sanctified by centuries, and carried by saints and soldiers alike. It is Mary's promise made visible, her tender defiance against every darkness that dares to touch her children. Each bead is a bullet of grace, each decade a shield of light, and when you pray it, especially when you can barely whisper the words she fights for you. I was terrified once, a veteran, wrote years after hearing Michael's story, but I held my rosary tight one night, and I realized fear doesn't vanish when you're brave. It vanishes when you're loved. That is the secret Michael died to reveal, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of faith, and that the rosary is not merely a devotion, it is a dialogue with heaven, bead by bead, breath by breath, until love overcomes everything that seeks to destroy us. So tonight, wherever you are, whether you're on a battlefield or in a quiet room, whether your wounds are visible or buried deep within, take up your own rosary, hold it as he did, pray it as countless souls before you have done, and as your fingers move along the beads, remember this soldier, not as a hero carved in stone, but as a brother in faith who whispered the same prayer you now whisper, Hail Mary, full of grace. Let the words become your armor, let her presence become your peace, and when fear rises again, when the noise of the world overwhelms you, listen for the still, small voice that echoes across time and eternity. She never fails. In every battle she stands beside you. Pray the rosary